Good morning, everyone. Shavua Tov and Chodesh Tov. So glad that you're all joining us this morning. We made it through the holidays. It wasn't simple, but we made it through the holidays. Thank God we made it through the summer and Pesach. And now we have a long and perhaps a potentially challenging winter ahead of us. It'll be a winter that's different than the winters we're usually accustomed to. But it's definitely important to somehow to remain strong, to remain inspired, and also to remain unified as a community. And that's one of the reasons why we're doing these lectures, is that we have to find ways to connect as a community. The essence of a shul is the bond, the communal bond between its congregants. A shul is called the Beit Knesset, a house of gathering, not a house of prayer, a Beit Tefillah, a house of gathering. And it's meant to unify individuals to a new reality called the tzibur, a community. And so we have to do our utmost to remain strong as a community. We on our side, from the administrative side, will do our best and to try to provide opportunities and programs. If anyone has any ideas or would like to just to reach out to talk, this is a very important thing to do, especially during these long months ahead of us, which is going to be a unique experience for all of us. At the community at Fifth Avenue Synagogue, we most definitely have a highly talented and passionate congregation, many unique individuals who care greatly and truly are concerned about Israel and the Jewish community at large. And two of those individuals we have presenting this morning, Daniel Arbess and Dovid Efune, both of them who are great, passionate individuals who don't only read the papers about what's going on, but want to make a difference on a hands-on way in a very toward difference for the great state of Israel, and also a difference in terms of the Jewish world at large. And we want to thank them for their participation at the shul for all these years and their efforts for the Jewish community. The reason why the Jewish community is great is because people care, and people not only care, but they try to make a difference. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Daniel, who's going to introduce this morning's program.
Thank you so much, Rabbi. Shavua Tov and Chodesh Tov. We have a variety of people, members of the synagogue, friends and family, even a couple of people, friends from Israel listening in today. So it's a great privilege to be here and to have the opportunity to introduce Dovid Efune. I think everyone knows about Dovid's background and current position as the editor-in-chief and really the engine intellectually behind the Algemeiner. Dovid also has a couple of rabbinic degrees, but I want to speak personally for a moment. I've known Dovid since he took over at Algemeiner, so that's about 12, 13 years. He's got a beautiful family and is a person of tremendous character, integrity, and passion for Israel. And I really view Dovid to be one of the next faces of leadership in the Jewish world that is rising. God knows that we need a new generation of thinkers making decisions in our world, and Dovid is going to be a key player there. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Dovid, and he's going to talk today about a topic that is very much on all of our minds, and that is the upcoming election and its implications for Israel. We are in a moment that I don't think I can remember in my lifetime where political views on political matters are very much divided between Jews in Israel, who 70% of whom are supportive of re-electing President Trump, and Jews in the United States, who are 63% favoring a Biden-Harris ticket at the moment based on current polls. And even within American Jewry, the divisions, I believe, are even more pronounced. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing what Dovid's impressions of all of that are. And then I'm hopeful that we're going to have a very open and spirited dialogue when we're done here. Dovid.
Well, first of all, Dan, thank you so much. It's so kind, and the feeling is absolutely mutual. I treasure greatly our friendship over the years and take great interest in your extensive activism on behalf of the cause of peace and, of course, for Israel's security and the strength between the relationship between Israel and the United States, which, of course, is also at the bedrock of our beautiful community at Fifth Avenue Synagogue. And it feels like so long that I've been with you in the same room, at the services, at the Kiddush, of course, most importantly, at the children's service. And myself and Mushka and the kids miss it very much. But obviously, this is a nice and really welcome reminder if we can get together in a virtual room of, the beauty and how much we treasure this special community. So thank you so much for having us. Thank you, Rachel, for all the work that you put into keeping us all connected. Thank you to Rabbi Babbage as well for your kind introduction and for keeping us all glued together at this strange and perilous time that we're all encountering together. I got to start with a series of disclaimers, okay? Every discussion that involves President Trump, you've got to have a little bit of nuance, but also just set the ground rules so that there's full understanding of what the goal over here is, and also what the limitations of the scope of discussion are. So the first thing I want to say is that there is no intention here in the course of this discussion to make a political endorsement. It is an analysis of the pros and the cons of either presidency, a Republican or a Democratic presidency. And secondly, and importantly, it's through a very narrow lens. There are a whole host of issues through which one could judge the pros and cons of voting Republican or Democrat in the upcoming election. We're focusing today on a very narrow set of issues, which is how a future second term with a Trump administration or a first term with a Biden administration is likely to affect the interest specifically of Israel and Israelis from the Israeli perspective, keeping in mind that things may be very different if you're an American Jew. You may have a different set of priorities. You may have a different set of concerns. That's fine. We're looking strictly at the implications for Israel on the 2020 elections from the Israeli perspective. And when I say the Israeli perspective, I mean that in the broadest sense of the word. Dan mentioned some of the numbers about Israeli polls. There's the Israeli public. Obviously, there are leaders. There's the government. There are diplomats, all of which I have had the privilege and honor of spending much time with and discussion over all of the pros and cons and various policy decisions that have been made over the last 4 years and the previous 4 years, and have been able to garner a sort of perspective on how things are viewed from their point of view, from the Israeli point of view. The final thing that I just want to say before we dive in is that it's important with regard to any discussions about President Trump that one is prepared from the outset to compartmentalize. I know it's sometimes a very hard thing to ask, and there are those that sort of don't want to engage in any discussion about Trump's policies because they see him as so repulsive on other issues. But in order to have a meaningful discussion and a serious discussion and a real discussion, a discussion that we're all gathered for today, you've got to be able to set those aside and address issue by issue, policy by policy, compartmentalizing completely, and being able to obviously focus on those key issues and gain some greater understanding of those key issues without dragging in everything else that Trump represents. And of course, there's a great deal that he does represent. Now, with that, let's dive right into it. I want to organize our discussion a little bit because the scope of what there is to discuss is massive. I'm going to talk till around 11:30-ish, and then, of course, Dan will lead us in a lively and vibrant discussion. Of course, I'm happy to respond to any challenges that you might have. And don't be shy. I'm used to it. So let's organize it as follows. There are 5 particular areas where I see a US administration impacting significantly in the Israeli theater. The first is what I would call military and even ideological support that takes the form in public statements and cooperation between the 2 governments in the broadest possible sense of the word, militaries, etc. The second is the issue of the Palestinians. The third, the issue of Iran. The fourth, what I'll call the region, countries in the region and developments in the region. And the fifth is the impact on US support for Israel. So that means how policies impact public perceptions and public support among the American public for Israel. So let's start with the easy one, which is the discussion about military support and, of course, ideological support. In each case, I'm going to go through how the Trump administration has acted and what sort of policies you might expect in the future, and then in turn, how the Biden administration might approach these issues, and then, of course, compare the two in terms of how these would be viewed from the Israeli perspective. So in terms of military support and cooperation, the first component is really financial, where the United States for years has made Israel one of the greatest beneficiaries of military aid. True, most of that aid needs to be spent in the United States, so it's partially a gift and partially a stimulus for the American military economy. And it's one of the areas where, give or take a few $1 million, a few $100 million, have been very consistent, have been supported by large majority of the United States Congress. And throughout the more challenging years of the Obama administration, this was an area that remained and continued. So the Trump administration has maintained military support for the United States and extensive military cooperation, as the Obama administration did so. And I think we can expect similar or the same from the Biden administration. Now, where there is a point of departure has been more in the vocal and ideological support for Israeli military action. Now, we saw throughout the years of the Obama administration, there was a very active effort to meddle, at least, I'm using meddle as a gentle word even, in Israel's military decisions. Now, primarily this played out when we were talking about Israel's actions in Gaza, actions to defend its citizens from rocket fire, and of course there have been a number of campaigns in the Gaza Strip. But it was almost, at the time when Israel was facing these challenges, it was at the same time facing a diplomatic assault, if you will, from the White House over the way that it was handling the military campaign in the Gaza Strip. Of course, from the Trump administration, we have seen no such thing, not the slightest effort to meddle or lecture or even involve themselves in any other way than to offer full-throated support for any Israeli military actions and activities in the region. And this includes both in Gaza, it includes covert actions, it includes in Syria, where Israel has been tremendously active, it includes in Lebanon. Perhaps we'll get to the issue of Iran soon. Perhaps on Iran, there have been some, behind the scenes discussions about, and coordination about when and where any potential action should be taken. And yes, possibly with the United States calling on Israel to withhold from certain activity. But for the most part, there has been this very stark differentiator between how, in voicing public support, the Trump administration has seconded itself to Israel's judgment, which of course is something that Israeli leaders are excited about. How things will look under a Biden administration. In general, there's a debate about how a Biden administration is going to view a lot of issues related to Israel. The debate centers around the extent of influence of the progressive wing of the party on a potential future Biden administration. Now, of course, there's no question that the more radically anti-Israel wing of the Democratic Party has gained in prominence in recent years. Having said that, through the primary season, their preferred candidate was Bernie Sanders. It was not Joe Biden. So even though it's obviously the case that Israel was not the central question for Democratic primary voters, the fact that Biden won in and of itself does present something of a defeat to the far left radical progressive wing of the party, which would like to see a very aggressive approach taken by a potential Biden administration vis-a-vis Israel. And that translated, if you look at the Democratic Party platform, it certainly wasn't perfect, and there's a lot in there that Israel would frown on and wouldn't like, but compared to how it has been in the past, and compared to what it could have been, it was what I would call relatively usual Democratic position on Israel, even more tame than what we saw under the Obama administration, possibly similar to what we saw in the Clinton administration, where there was certainly a strong difference in policy and in how things should be enacted and the rights of Palestinians and whether there should be a Palestinian state. But they removed, for example, the idea that aid to Israel should be conditioned on its activities in the settlements, for example, which I think a lot of people saw as a positive development. So could have been worse, let's put it that way. And I think the debate over how far a Biden administration might go remains an open one, but the fact that it was Biden and not Sanders, and the indications that we have seen so far point us towards a strong possibility that we might see a return to a sort of Clinton era approach to Israel, with, of course, the looming concern, and it's a serious concern, that the left wing of the party may continue to gain in strength and start to assert influence over key issues related to Israel. So that's category number one. Category number two, the Palestinians. Now, the changes that we've seen under a Trump administration vis-a-vis the Palestinians have been radical. I have in the past referred to it as basically a massacre of sacred cows. There were so many assumptions, key assumptions and presuppositions that were in place under many previous administrations that the Trump administration has discarded. The first one is whether or not the Palestinians are the appropriate destination for placing political pressure. In the past, the approach has said Israel is a stronger power, they have more agency, they're the ones that need to be pushed for whatever diplomatic outcome we're looking to achieve. The Palestinians are weaker. If we push them too hard, they may lose control of their own government. Let's lay off and take it easy. This administration has had absolutely no qualms in pressuring the Palestinians, and very aggressively so. The second, and I'll go through some of the details in terms of how they've done that, but the second very key and fundamental differentiator in terms of how the Palestinians issue has been viewed by the Trump administration is that the Palestinian issue is not the center of the Middle East conflict. It is not the center of the Middle East conflict. I repeat that because it is so fundamental to the approach that the Trump administration has taken for decades. For decades, the conventional view was that if you solve the Palestinian issue, you will bring peace to the Middle East. All radicalism in the region is fueled at its center by this unresolved sore that is festering and instigating and inspiring all form of radicalism across the Middle East. The Trump administration on day one made clear that the Palestinian issue is not the center of the conflict. It can be dealt with last, if at all. And we'll deal with that a little bit more when we talk about the region. Of course, some of the key pressure points that the Trump administration applied on the Palestinians involved shutting down the mission in DC, include the Taylor Force Act, which the Trump administration got behind, even if it didn't instigate it, the defunding of UNRWA and various other Palestinian agencies, the statement by the State Department that the United States no longer views settlement activity to be illegal under international law, which is a huge, 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 huge statement in contravention to how I think this issue is viewed by many, many other countries. So it sort of really draws a line under the Israeli position on this issue. It's been a policy that I would refer to as one of cascading hammers, where there are one after the other consequences that have been lined up for the Palestinians to face in the event that they are not willing to engage in true and genuine, sincere peace talks with the Israelis. And of course, they haven't responded positively. It seems that they're waiting to see the outcome of this election in terms of deciding on their future approach to the issue. But certainly that pressure has been consistent and sustained, and a huge departure from how this issue has been approached in the past. So that's the category of the Palestinians, category 2. Category 3, Iran. Now, this issue is the issue that is going to be the most significant for Israeli leaders, but by quite a large margin. The Trump administration was quick to pull out of the Iran deal, consistently labeling it as a useless diplomatic endeavor. They have increased sanctions on Iranian leaders, on sectors of the Iranian economy, consistently and on a continued basis. There's more sanctions activity every couple of months coming from the Trump administration. There has also been a very strict no tolerance policy for what I would refer to as the Iranian strategy of incremental belligerence, where there's sort of a slow and steady effort to push the boundaries and, increase what is accepted by the United States in terms of malign Iranian activity. So under the Obama administration, for example, we saw the detaining of American Navy personnel. We saw the attempted harassment of US vessels in the region by small fast boats that the Iranian Navy deploys. Certainly, the Trump administration has laid down the law, and we've seen a very, very significant decline in these areas. Most importantly, the IRGC, which stands at the center of Iranian expansionism. Of course, the Iranian regime's hold on power within the country. This is the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps, the military strength of the Iranian regime, has been labeled by the Trump administration as a terror group. That, of course, gives the US government very significant tools to be able to limit and stem the activities of this group around the world, which, of course, has significant impact not just for Israel and on Iranian activities, but also for Jews around the world. The IRGC was responsible for the bombing of the Amir Jewish Center in Buenos Aires, Argentina in 1994. Was one of the, I think it was the largest terror attack, the single greatest loss of Jewish life since the Holocaust. 85 people were killed, the youngest of which was 5 years old. It's increasingly believed that the IRGC was responsible for that attack. It was also responsible, if you recall, for the 2012 attack in Burgas, Bulgaria, on Israeli tourists, where a bus was blown up, and I believe there were 6 or 7 victims of that attack. It's Iran's terror arm around the world, and in maintaining control over its own population, and of course in spreading its belligerence around the region. Huge step for the Trump administration to label the IRGC as a terror group. Taking out Qasem Soleimani was a very significant action on a number of levels. First of all, it certainly set the stage for the Iranians to understand that this wasn't just bravado. The United States was willing to take action. Soleimani was a hugely influential figure in terms of Iranian meddling across the globe, a brilliant strategist. His assassination is a huge loss to Iranian efforts to export its regime and ideology across the region and around the world. But beyond the specific loss of Soleimani's capabilities, the message that it sent was incredibly powerful and incredibly important. Now, there are two areas I want to stress of concern about how the Trump administration has approached Iran. The first is Syria and the tendency towards what you might call isolationism or non-interventionism, which has been a center point of the Trump administration's policies and also stood at the core of his conflict with National Security National Security Advisor John Bolton, who ended up leaving the administration over these the conflicts over isolationism and non-interventionism. Trump's efforts to pull all United States personnel out of Syria, which were announced after a discussion with Turkey's Erdogan, subsequently rolled back a little bit. It's unclear exactly where things are standing in the region, but that really caused alarm among Israeli leaders. I don't want to get into too much detail now, but it's no surprise that many of Israel's borders are beset by terror encampments, and the Iranian regime is actively seeking to do so on the Syrian border with the Golan Heights, which has been a quiet border for Israel for a very, very long time. And having an American presence in the region was helpful, very, very helpful for Israeli efforts, primarily not just as a deterrent, but as a land block for providing a bulwark against the flow of weapons from Iran across northern Iraq and into Syria that could then be established and set up on Israel's northern border. Another area of concern, unresolved concern, is in how Trump plans to approach Iran should he be reelected. He's been talking a lot about a new deal with the Iranian regime and talking about a deal that might come very quickly. Within a month after being reelected, he says, I will have a new deal with the Iranian regime. There's not a lot of information of what that might entail. And there is some concern over how Trump views the Iranians and if he sees them as being sort of similar to the North Koreans, where he's enacted a very specific playbook, which I believe, and I think many others who watch the region closely believe, won't work when it comes to the Iranians. The North Korean playbook will not work when it comes to the Iranians. You need a different approach. And again, that's a discussion on its own. I don't want to, get on a tangent because it's a big and serious discussion on its own. But suffice it to say that there is certainly appreciation on the Israeli side that Trump has pulled out of the Iran deal and taken a tough and aggressive stance towards the Ayatollah regime. Having said that, when he talks about a new deal, there are those that would like to see a little bit more detail and are concerned over specifically what that might entail and what approach a future Trump administration might take if given another 4 years. In terms of how Biden might approach this issue, I'm quite confident from the Israeli perspective this would be the greatest area of disappointment. There have been open promises to get back into the Iran deal and continue to pursue the approach that the Obama administration pursued, which caused no end of frustration and fear and concern among Israeli leaders across the political spectrum. There is very broad consensus on this issue. There is very, very broad consensus on this issue among the Israeli public. and among Israeli politicians. In fact, leading Israeli opposition members have said publicly on some occasions that they disagree with Netanyahu on everything except the issue of Iran. On this, we are basically the same. I know it's already 11:30. Dan, give us another 5 minutes and we'll wrap this up and then get into the discussion. So that brings us to the end of issue number 3. Issue number 4, the region. Of course, we've all followed closely with great delight how the Abraham Accords unfolded. This is an achievement that is historic. It has been dismissed and derided by some in the press. It is a historic and fundamental achievement. Responsible for it, I believe, are Trump's senior advisor, Jared Kushner, and son-in-law, and also Ambassador David Friedman, who's taken a very active role in the region. And their understanding has been fundamental. In fact, it was my friend Ken Kurson, who is a former editor of the New York Observer and a political advisor, was interviewed by the New York Times when Jared was first appointed. And he said, he was asked, this guy has no experience. What makes anybody think that he's equipped for this role? And he said, look, this is a region that for 40 years has evaded solutions from the most qualified experts in the world. So why not give a fresh, bright, forward-thinking mind a chance? And the truth is, he deserves all the credit. He took some time to speak to the various leaders, especially younger leaders in the region, to understand where they were at and where they would like to see the region go. And recognizing, first and foremost, as mentioned earlier, that the Palestinian issue really was a sideshow to the greater question of relations between Israel and the Arab world, recognizing the great benefit and advantage that is presented to various Arab states by enhancing relations with Israel. The solutions that Israeli industry present to many of the day-to-day problems that are faced by others in the region, whether it's water issues, agricultural issues, cybersecurity issues, intelligence issues. Israel has out-of-the-box solutions on a host of the issues that are plaguing leaders in the region. This is a partnership of interests that have advanced beyond the differences that existed for many, many years. And the Trump administration has been right to seize on that and to push it forward and to create the start of a new reality, which I believe will continue to develop under a continued Trump administration. There was also a recognition of the Golan Heights, of Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights, which of course is another important regional development. One area of regional concern, I thought the Trump administration pursued a terrible, ghastly policy towards the Kurds, both in the Turkish theater and also in the referendum on Kurdish independence that took place towards the beginning of the Trump administration by the Kurdish regional government in the north of Iraq. Again, this is a subject in and of itself, but suffice it to say that there were quite a few of us who feel that that was a grave strategic error on behalf of the Trump administration. I don't know if a Biden administration would have approached that issue differently. Past actions might lead us to think that they wouldn't, but important to note nonetheless that this was a serious area of failing. In terms of how the Biden administration will approach the future of the region and how the Abraham Accords initiative might develop under a Biden administration, the truth is it's harder to say than in any of the other areas. Certainly, there would be initially more reluctance from others in the region. They have to feel confident and secure that they won't be betrayed in the future. They have to feel confident and secure that the issue of the Palestinians is not going to be thrust right to the front and center again of American foreign policy in order to be able to move forward and to take risks and further steps in this direction. So I think the chances are considerably higher that the Abraham Accords initiative will continue under a Trump administration. But it's also possible that developments in the region will move faster and quicker and are stronger than any potential Biden administration may wish, and therefore this progression might continue even under a Biden administration. Now, one more issue that's important to recall is the Trump administration's approach to Israel at the United Nations. This really sort of fits into the first category, but I didn't mention it then, so I'm going to mention it briefly now. But the full-throated support for Israel withdrawing from the Human Rights Council, for example, the tenure of Nikki Haley initially, and now Kelly Craft, has been an era of incredible blessing for the Israelis at the United Nations, and that's another area that they will be grateful for and possibly concerned for how that might develop under Biden administration. Now, I want to address the fifth and final area, and then we'll move on to some discussion, which I'm very, very much looking forward to, and that is the impact on U.S. support for Israel in the American public. Now, there is a line of reasoning, and I would say a compelling line of reasoning, that because Trump is viewed so negatively by a large percentage of the American public, so the positions that he's taken consequently will also be viewed in the same way. And that the open alignment between the Trump administration and the Netanyahu government in Israel, and as Dan mentioned in some of the polls, the Israeli people and the Trump administration, is going to drive a further wedge between support for Israel in the Democratic Party. I don't think there's any question that it's great interest for the future of U.S.-Israel relations and for the future security of the Jewish state that support for Israel in the United States is fully a bipartisan endeavor and never becomes a domain of any one particular party. In that sense, having said that, I think anecdotally, it's a serious concern. Having said that, from any of the numbers that I have seen so far, it doesn't seem to have borne out quite yet. Support for Israel among the American public has remained consistent over decades, and the numbers remain so. There has been some concern expressed over specifically how younger Americans and American Jews feel about this issue. But I would say, until there are some serious numbers, the concern is more of an anecdotal concern. It's more of a fair and thoughtful concern that supporters of Israel have articulated. So I would say it remains an open question, something to keep a very, very close eye on, and to pursue and work to whatever extent we're able to maintain that bipartisan support for Israel in the United States. Having said that, there isn't clear evidence yet that the Trump administration has caused significant damage in that area. Concern, yes. Evidence, not yet. And I think there's one other area that needs to be mentioned, and that is the tools that the Trump administration has provided to American supporters of Israel to push back against those that are discriminating against Israel and supporters of Israel on American college campuses and beyond. And to that, I'm specifically referring to the Title VI enactment that includes discrimination against people who hold a favorable view of Israel and Israelis as being under the umbrella of racial and discrimination and other forms of discrimination. We've already seen the impact that that's had on campus, and significant. And God knows Jewish students and pro-Israel students on American college campuses who are a besieged group need all the help and the support that they can get. So that brings us to the end of the 5 points. I've tried to touch on as many issues as possible, but of course I'm happy to elaborate in our discussions. In sum, I would say as follows. From the Israeli perspective, from the perspective of the Israeli public, the Israeli government, Israeli diplomats, Israeli bureaucrats, even many in the Israeli media, there is an overall incredibly positive approach and sentiment towards the Trump administration and the policies that they can have enacted. In some conversations, I've almost got the impression that they cannot believe their luck. It's like after 8 years of Obama, the years of famine that Egypt was faced with, now they have experienced the years of plenty. Policy after policy after policy that they have wished for and hoped for and encouraged have been enacted by the Trump administration. Now, of course, many American Jews don't agree with the Israeli government's approach to these issues, and certainly not with the Trump administration's approach to this issue. Many American Jews, and they will have a different view of the situation, and obviously have a different set of priorities. I think under a Biden administration, we're likely to see something in the middle of what we had under Clinton and what we had under Obama in terms of an approach to Israel, with obviously the details remaining to be seen. So with that, I will end my initial opening remarks and look forward very, very much to engaging with each of you in discussion under Dan's leadership. And
Dovid, thank you very, very much. I think that was a super setting of the framework. We have about 41 Jews on this call, and we want to give everybody an opportunity to participate. I can tell you, you would not fly on CNBC. That was a long one, and I think it was interesting. So let me give you a couple of comments on it, and then I'm going to open it up for questions. Everyone, please indicate in the chat room, I think is the place, or maybe there's a place where you can raise your hand to ask questions. I'm not sure. I don't see that on mine, but let us know in some fashion whether you want to make a comment or a question. My comments, Dovid, if you give me a second, are the following. I think what we're talking about here is what aligns in the United States policy with the policies of the government of Israel. That is the standard that we need to be worried about. The government of Israel speaks for the Israeli people. And when we think about what has happened during the Trump administration years, I don't think there's any dispute that the Trump administration policies and specific steps have been terrific and consistent with Israeli policy. During the Trump years, Israel's status has been elevated as an economic, as a democratic, as an intelligence and diplomatic leader in the region, a light unto nations. I think to a large extent, we have Obama to thank for that, because the JCPOA really got the attention of the Arab neighbors of Israel and had the Arab neighbors of Israel thinking very carefully about where their interests lie, and that is with Israel. And Israel's power and importance to the United States through the Abraham Accords and the region realignment, in my view, have significantly expanded, pretty much to the point where I would venture to say that the United States needs Israel for its diplomatic and economic and intelligence skills and role in the Middle East right now, almost as much, or maybe as much or more than Israel needs the United States. So against that backdrop, I think the question to ask is, you gave us a very detailed review of what the Trump administration has done that has been consistent with Israel's interests. I think it behooves us to foam the runway for a potential Biden administration and think about what might happen under President Biden administration leadership. I think it's not as bad as it may appear to some. Biden, personally, I think has a good relationship with Bibi Netanyahu, certainly a lot better than Obama did. I think that there's an opportunity for a potential Biden-Harris ticket and administration to start relations with Israel with a smooth landing, recognizing that things have changed in the region over the past 4 years as a result of this regional integration and other factors that have taken place. And so I'm not as worried, for example, about, the gang, which you referred to as the radical left of the Democratic Party, for some of the reasons that you stated, but more importantly, because Biden certainly must realize that he's at most a one-term president. He himself is a compassionate character, is a lifelong public servant. And, I don't think that he needs and will need or feel the need to pander to, the marginal wings of the Democratic Party. He's an economic and political centrist, and one hopes that he'll continue to be. Now, in regard to the JCPOA and Iran, I was particularly encouraged by Kamala Harris's initial position on the JCPOA, which was very similar to President Trump's. She talked about the need to renegotiate the JCPOA to address some of the deficiencies, which I don't need to get into here. We all know what they are. However, I was very disappointed to see in the vice presidential debate that she backtracked from that position and said flat out that she'd like to re-enter the original JCPOA. That's not encouraging relative to the Biden administration. As far as the Palestinians are concerned, this is where I think there's a real opportunity. Israeli policy has been, for many years, to maintain the status quo and to let the Palestinian issue fade into the background. I think that Jared Kushner and the Trump administration did a fantastic job of reading the signals from Prime Minister Netanyahu, Dori Gold, and other people in the background, and pursuing policies, specifically the regional realignment, which was highly timely, that have basically moved the Palestinian issue into the background. And I think that the Trump plan for the Palestinians brilliantly realigned the Oslo formulation from land for peace, where Israel was giving up land and not getting peace, such as Gaza, for example, and even the original Oslo Accords in 93, to what I would call peace for land, which is, okay, Palestinians, you demonstrate that you're serious about peace by meeting these preconditions. Stop the indoctrination of your citizens in education, stop funding terrorists and their families, and adhere to the rule of law. Then we can talk about a potential state. So he's put the onus on the Palestinians to demonstrate that they're serious about coexisting with Israel, starting with recognizing Israel's right to exist. And the Palestinians have dismally failed to even engage with Israel, which tells a very clear story about what the original endgame of the Oslo arrangement was, all the way going back to before Arbess, going back to the original architect of the Oslo agreements for the Palestinians. I believe that the Oslo arrangements were simply a very clever play by the Palestinians that allowed them to continue the resistance to Israel's existence under cover of trying to get to peace. But they, that I've had direct personal, extensive engagement with both Arbess and, for the last 4 years, Erkat, who, by the way, is in an Israeli hospital being treated for COVID today. And I have no illusion as to this generation of Palestinians, or frankly, the next one's intention of living and coexisting with Israel on Israelis' native homeland in Judea and Samaria. So I believe, and this is an area of great opportunity for Vice President Biden, should he enter office, he has an opportunity to pick up this issue and extend the benefits that the Trump administration has created for the region by resolving the Palestinian issue in a completely thoughtful and new direction, which has to do with, Jordan. And the Jordan piece is the missing piece, and I believe the next piece of the regional rearrangement that's got to be coming. We can talk in much more detail later about what else needs to take place But ultimately, I foresee a resolution of the Palestinian issue that leaves the borders of Israel from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean and still takes care of the dignity and the civic democratic aspirations of the Palestinian, so-called Palestinian people on the West Bank in a satisfactory way while economically integrating them. But let's just stop now because, okay, I did that. I was good, 5 minutes. Let's take some questions. And if we don't have questions, we can just open it up to everybody and have a free for all. Let me just see, do I have any questions here? Okay, question. How can any Jew not support Trump who has died me so much for Israel? I think did so much for Israel. No one mentioned moving the embassy, hiring David Friedman. I think Dovid mentioned David Friedman. Moving the embassy was one on a long list of things that President Trump has done that has been beneficial to Israel and to the whole region. Dovid, do you have any other comments? And let's see if we've got any more questions.
I'll address that briefly, and I wanted to share a few more thoughts on your remarks, Dan, and thank you for sharing that additional perspective with us. Yeah, I didn't mention the moving of the embassy. It's certainly important to add that in there. Although I don't like to put that front and center because everybody else does. It's always like the start of all the arguments and discussions about Trump and Israel. And in the end of the day, it's a very, very small fraction of the big picture. So yes, important to mention that definitely fits into one of the categories that we discussed before as a very, very important development, especially as the Israeli perspective is concerned. Dan, just a few thoughts on, well, before we get to that, how can any Jew not support Trump? Okay, I've heard that question before. In the end of the day, people have different sets of priorities. That's really what it boils down to. If you want to understand the difference between a Jew who supports Trump and a Jew who doesn't support Trump, a lot of them will agree on whether Trump has been, good for the Israeli position and for Israel's security. But you've got to ask them, when it comes to voting, what are your top priorities? And for a lot of people, Israel is just not even on the list. Now,
well, let me just interject on that for 1 second, David, on that, because this is something that weighs on my mind, and I believe the mind of a lot of people in the modern Orthodox community, and certainly in the conservative Jewish community in the United States. If we assume that part of our purpose in life as individuals is to help to sanctify the world, we have to ask ourselves some very difficult questions about the character of the people that we are electing to leadership and the effect of their character and their behavior on the culture of our community, of our nation, and of the rest of the whole world. That's a legitimate question that people have raised, and it certainly weighs on me. And I'd like to hear. I'm not going to name the panelists who raised that question, but I'd be very happy to unmute him and hear what he has to say about that from a moral and religious perspective as well.
Now, look, on top of that, Dan, there are also differences of opinion from a policy perspective in what is good for Israel. There are many Jews that see
right. Jews friends don't let friends drive drunk.
Exactly. That's the approach.
Who are we to tell Israel what's good for Israel?
Right. And so you have many American Jews that take that approach. Now, just I want to address quickly your remarks from before in terms of how a potential Biden administration might view Israel. And the truth is, the way that you articulated it, there is a potential opportunity there. I mean, it's any new administration can come in with a fresh set of eyes and pick up where the previous administration left off and move the ball forward in a positive way. Having said that, I think
having said that, the problem is that Biden is surrounded by Jews who are exactly whose views are consistent with Obama's on Israel. That's a real problem.
Not just Jews, but if you look at the foreign policy team that he's built so far, you've got people like Jake Sullivan and Tony Blinken and potentially Susan Rice and others like that. And there is a fundamentally different worldview on these two key issues. The first one being whether the Palestinian issue is at the center of the conflict or not. And the second one being whether Iran is the most important belligerent actor in the region, or the actor that needs to command the most attention and the most discipline, or
well, but hold it.
is actually a positive.
1 second, David. 1 second. It's been demonstrated in the last 4 years, and I think it needs to be stated again so that it sinks in to the Obama holdover mindset, that the Palestinians are not the primary issue in the region. The primary issue in the region is Sunni and Shia, and it has to do with Turkey coming down the wire for the next administration. And I believe that we need to be vocal about getting people focused on where things are right now. The Iran preference, the share the neighborhood with Iran that came from Obama, was Valerie Jarrett. I don't know, and I'm not sure any of us know, how deeply Biden is committed to the Iranians. We know that Kerry was, because his best buddy is with them, but Kerry is gone right now. Okay, Kerry is finished.
Look, I think if you look at the key leading lights in the foreign policy discourse from the Democratic Party side, there hasn't really been a serious acknowledgement of the point that you're making, that things have changed in the region. I mean, we saw people like, Dan Shapiro even, and Martin Indyk, and sort of hanging on to elements of how things were before, and even criticizing the Abraham Accords as being, leaving the Palestinians out in the cold and therefore not constructive to the future of peace in the region. So I'd love to see more leading lights in foreign policy expertise from sort of democratic leading think tanks that will espouse the view that you've just espoused correctly.
Well, we have to make the people are entrenched, endowed in their, in the heuristics of their past framework. We have to guide them. That's what you do at Algemeiner. We have to get those ideas in circulation so they begin to penetrate people's consciousness. Okay, we have another question here, Dovid, if I may. Do you have anything else to add before I take the next question?
No, go ahead.
All right, it says, I agree with how comfortable American Jews support Trump's approach on Israel. I'm not sure I understand that. I think Israel should be every American Jew's priority. It's an issue for every American Jew. It's his extra issue. Okay, that's a statement. I said that. Any other questions?
Yes, Dan, thank you so much. I just want to bring up a topic that both you and Dovid brought up, which I think may require a greater exploration. It appears to me that there's really three political parties in the United States right now. You have the Trump, the Trump supporters. You have the traditional Democratic perspective, and then, as Dovid mentioned, you have this new position of the radical left. And right now, the Democratic position and this new growing movement is really one party. And the question really is to what degree one's going to win over the other. As you mentioned, Daniel, you feel that the Biden-Harris ticket is going to have a strong position, and in terms of their convictions, and they're not going to be swayed by smaller contingent. But let's also not forget that if it wasn't for the Democratic Party organizing themselves, that together, to join together as one, that's the only reason Biden became the nominee. And the position that in the last election was considered to be like a fringe position that had no chance of ever becoming a mainstream, this election would have become mainstream if not for the fact that that the Democratic ticket organized themselves to put Biden as the nominee. So the questions I wanted to present to you: to what degree do people feel that if Biden and Harris do get elected, to what degree do people feel that they're going to really be continue their position that until now, or to what degree will the new radical left, quote unquote, have an influence on what their position towards Israel is, which of course I think greatly concerns many of us.
So, Rabbi, with great respect, I want to encourage that we be careful with labels like radical left, with all labels, and try to think about what people's values are being expressed. So I think about the so-called radical left as people who are concerned about equality, who are concerned about economic inequality, lack of access to social mobility in this country, and who are not well informed on questions related to Israel. And so it behooves us to engage their intentions, to look at their intentions in a positive light and try to educate them. Some of them will fail. Okay, Ilhan Omar, we know, is anti-Semitic. Okay, others will fail, but some will be successful to bring them along and show them the light of what Israel really is. As far as Biden and Harris are concerned, Harris has a big base of Jewish support, has Jewish kids, a Jewish husband. I believe she's not widely informed on economics and foreign affairs, but she's going to get there. She's intelligent, she's genuine, she's human. I'm not advocating anybody, right? I'm struggling with this decision for myself, but I tend to believe the most important thing is that Biden is not going to be thinking about his reelection on day one. Maybe Harris will be, but Biden will not be. So when you say, well, it was only that the Democratic Party came together and decided to make Biden the nominee, that's exactly what's supposed to happen, because Biden reflects the consensus views of the country, which I continue to believe are still economic moderation and foreign policies that reflect the values of this country. And so I think that Biden will be true to his own character and history and will not be dragged into these directions of economic policy primarily and foreign policy that are off center. And that's what I believe will happen, but nobody knows for sure.
And Dovid?
I want to add some thoughts here in support of the point that the rabbi was making. If you haven't already read it, encourage everybody to read an article that appeared not in our newspaper, in Tablet Magazine, called Stop Being Shocked. It was published on October 14th by Barry Weiss, former editor at the New York Times, in which she outlines in great detail the point that you have made here, Rabbi, right? We're referring to it in very simplistic terms, and I think, Dan, you're right about that. It is simplistic to refer to, a radical left, for example, because it's actually more than that. There is a movement in this country, which, I'll post a link in a minute into the chat so everybody can find it. It's an illiberal movement, a movement that wants to position everybody in the country as either racist or anti-racist. A movement that basically sees the very differences that make us unique and special as being in and of themselves a symptom of what is wrong with society. Its most famous proponent is a BU professor called Ibram X. Kendi, who's gained a lot of prominence nowadays with his teachings. Barry addresses this issue in relation to the decision by AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the US New York Congresswoman, who declined to attend a memorial for Yitzhak Rabin, okay, the martyr for peace, who gave up his life for the cause of peace. She was originally scheduled to participate. She pulled out of the event, and many American Jews were shocked, especially progressive American Jews. How could it be? This is as good as it gets. Rabin would have agreed with everything that you speak of, the rights for the Palestinians and human rights and two states and everything else. Why, I get it if you don't want to come to an Ariel Sharon memorial or a Yitzhak Shamir memorial or a Menachem Begin memorial or something like that, but Yitzhak Rabin, how can a major politician in this country just trample on the grave of Yitzhak Rabin like that. And she's a very
but Dovid,
hang on, Dan. Let me just finish the point. We'll get to it in a second. I just want to finish making the point. This is a very powerful movement, and maybe we need to be a little bit more specific about how we describe it. But its implications for the future of this country and certainly for future support of Israel have yet to be seen. The movement certainly wants to eliminate Jewish identity, in the broadest sense of what that means. And we've seen that enacted on campuses. We've seen how that plays out in the public space. We've seen now that this is sort of an ideology that's taken over universities. It's now, and cultural institutions, sports, for example, it's now making major inroads when it comes to the business world and various major companies and industry, etc. So we have yet to see the extent of the impact of this ideology. But if just to elaborate a little bit more on what you refer to as the third party, this is it. And I think it's fair to say, as Barry says, and Barry is certainly not a Trump supporter or a Trump voter, that Biden will certainly not act as a bulwark against this ideology. And it's something that we have to be very concerned about, despite the fact that, as Dan says, Biden is not the same as Obama. He has his own track record, he has his own history, and he's certainly much warmer in concept to support for the Jewish state in general. Nevertheless, his ability to stand up to and hold back the tide of this aggressive ideology really remains to be seen and is a matter of huge concern. I'm going to chat to everybody the link to this article now if they want to read it.
I did it already, Dovid. It's done.
Okay, good.
Look. I've been around for many election cycles now. Okay, there are and people on this call, those who are still here, and we still have a high 30s. And by the way, anybody can drop any time now because we're probably going to go on for as long as until everybody's gone. But Dovid, there are always nutcases. There are always radical fringe ideas. The question is, are we legitimizing them by pulling them out of the rubble and making them a huge, big deal? Okay, just like the business about Obama going to church with a guy who is an anti-Semite. Obama was not personally an anti-Semite. Okay, Obama didn't personally question Israel's right to exist. He was naive and uninformed, but his intentions were not to wipe out the Jewish people or Israel. And in fact, as you know, he provided more economic support to Israel than any president in history. So I think we have to look realistically. Now, I'm personally concerned that we have a much bigger issue of anti-Semitism because there is huge economic inequality that's building up here and huge fiscal problems that are being accumulated in response to COVID and other things, which, by the way, Trump has contributed to, but has finally started to limit, that are going to create economic problems that will ultimately be blamed on Jews. And we've already seen the beginnings of anti-Semitism in this country in the last couple of years. If we're going to deal with that, we should deal with it thoughtfully, not be focused on the margins and AOC and Ilhan Omar. We have much bigger issues that we need to deal with rather than trying to expand, these one-off characters. If we're afraid of, and by the way, Israel is not afraid. Okay, why should we be afraid of one or two of these people? They're not going to change. We're never going to have the acceptance by the Jews of what's happened to the Jews historically. That's why Israel is there, Dovid. So what we need to do, and one of the comments that's been posted here in the chat has been, Israel is our number one concern, and it's not a question of divided loyalties. And I do feel when we vote, we have to think about what's best for the country we're voting for, and we also have to think about what's best for ourselves. But I consider, and I'm speaking very personally here, mainly because it's mostly family that's left on the phone, I consider myself first and foremost a Jew, which means Israel, and then an American and Canadian. You understand? And so if we're voting for ourselves, we need to make sure that Israel remains strong. And certainly the Trump administration has assisted Israel in doing this in the United States' own interest, but Israel is now strong enough to stand on its own as well, and strong enough to be an equal partner with the Biden administration, if there is a Biden administration, or any other administration in foreign affairs.
So Dan, I wish you were right when you say that this is, a marginal issue. This is an issue that we are engaged in from morning till night, and I can tell you that it is a wave. I'll just read a couple of sentences from Barry's article because she really captures it well.
I read it, but okay.
But I want others to hear. Did you see that the Ethical Culture Field School hosted a speaker that equated Israel with the Nazis? Did you know that Brearley is now asking families to write a statement demonstrating their commitment to anti-racism? Did you see that Chelsea Handler tweeted a clip of Louis Farrakhan? Did you see that protesters tagged a synagogue in Kenosha with Free Palestine graffiti? Did you hear?
Right. Look. One of our participants posted something saying, "Look at England. He's 100% right. Look what happened to the Labour Party. All right. Look what's happening in France. I agree."
Dan, let me finish the point. You'll respond afterwards. Did you hear about the march in DC where they chanted, "Israel, we know you. You murder children too"? There was also another chant where they compared Bibi to Hitler. Did you hear that the Biden campaign apologized to Linda Sarsour after initially disavowing her? Did you see that Twitter suspended Brett Weinstein's article, civic organization, but it still allows the Iranian Ayatollah to openly promote genocide of the Jewish people? Did you see that Mayor de Blasio scapegoated the Jewish community for the spread of COVID in New York while defending mass protests? These are just a couple.
Yeah. Did you see that Cory Booker voted for the JCPOA? Did you see what's happening in the rest of the world? I agree. There's anti-Semitism is a real problem, but does anybody know what Donald Trump deep in his heart feels? Believe me, I'm not advocating for or against Donald Trump or Joe Biden. I'm just saying this is a problem, and it's a problem that we need to hold all of our leaders accountable for. But thank God that we have Israel as what it is.
Look, the question of, we're focused now on the narrow question of really the future of the Democratic Party. The point that Rabbi Babich, brought up, a very important insight into the battle that's now taking place over the heart and soul of the party, and this new insidious ideology that is incredibly dangerous to Jews, as Barry highlights. And Elie Wiesel, the great Nobel laureate who was a member of our community, but was also a dear friend of the Algemeiner. He was the chairman of our committee until his last day, and a great friend of Gershon Jacobson, who founded the Algemeiner. Very, very famously said that our silence helps the oppressor and never the oppressed. This is a question that we face very often. If people come to the Algemeiner and say, "Why do you write about this? Why do you write about that?" Maybe you're just giving fuel to this nutcase and that nut job. Because when you don't call it out and put a line in the sand and scream and shout and highlight it, it doesn't get smaller. It gets bigger. It grows, it expands, it feeds on itself. And we've seen that with this new ideology. I'm not even sure exactly what to call it, but it's referred to, as Barry says, as an illiberal ideology because it stands against the key principles of liberalism on which this country has flourished for centuries.
David and
sorry, go on.
What?
I'd like to speak.
We don't disagree, Dovid. I'm not suggesting that we should accept it.
Can I ask you a question?
Well,
Can I ask you a question?
Daniel, so in general, the program.
Let Michael Fiskus ask a question. Let's let some other people participate.
Yeah,
Okay.
I am. The programs we usually conduct last around an hour and 20 minutes. So we're gonna try to wrap things up now with some final questions. It is a very passionate topic, and as Daniel said, we could spend many hours online. But maybe we'll just try to begin wrapping up this morning's program, which has been very interesting. So if Michael, if you kindly present your question now.
Okay, I'd just like to ask Daniel a question, if I might. He asked, what would religious leaders say about Trump's character? And that was addressed by the Gadol Hador, Rabbi Kamenetsky. And he was the Messiah at the Siyum HaShas, as you all remember. And he said that he supports Donald Trump. He said Jews should support Donald Trump. And he was asked about his character. He said it's just the way of rich people. That was his answer. And then as for another comment that I'd like to make to Daniel also is that I would remind him that Joe Biden threatened Menachem Begin at a 1983 Senate Foreign Relations Committee of pulling all aid to Israel because he read in an Arab newspaper that Israel used the bunker buster bomb in Lebanon. And if you want to hear Begin's response, you should listen to it. It's on YouTube. He answered Biden. I think it would be very interesting if you would listen to it. And again, just to make another point to Daniel, I'm sorry, I'm taking too long. Harry Truman, in his heart, maybe not a great lover of Jews, but he was, he led to the forming of the state of Israel. So now I'm going to, that's all I have to say. I like
Michael, thank you for all of that. I agree with all of it. And all I can say is I look forward to the Prime Minister of Israel responding to the next time somebody gives him a lecture the same way as Menachem Begin did to Joe Biden back then, because that was a legendary response. You remember, if you can tell, he basically said, go to hell. We'll do what we're going to do for the interest of Israel.
Daniel, if we could kindly take one more question, then maybe afterwards, both you and Dovid could give one final statement, like I do at the, at the debates, and then we'll wrap up this morning's program. So Daniel, you could choose. I think that.
I have one from Rivka Rothschild. She
Hello.
said, my question for you and Dovid Efune is, why should Jews continue to support the Democrats who give lots of voice to the radical left in their midst in Congress and connect themselves with Al Sharpton and Farrakhan? Dovid, you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, look, I said at the beginning that the purpose of this discussion is not really to tell anybody who to vote for, but to analyze the issues. And of course, every person who's listening and people beyond that who are looking at these issues will have to make their own judgments. Why they reach one conclusion or the other is beyond the scope of my ability to be able to tell you, but certainly the issues that you bring up, too much tolerance for some of the anti-Semitism that we've seen in the Democratic Party, particularly from Ilhan Omar and others, is definitely of concern, and too much tolerance for the likes of Al Sharpton and Farrakhan is of concern. Those two are not the same, they're not in the same category exactly, but that's definitely of concern. I should stress also that there are issues on the Republican side that also need to be strongly and firmly addressed. I'm not saying that they're equal, but before he died, I did the last interview, I think, with Ed Koch about 3 weeks before he died. And one of the things that he told me in the interview, he was a regular columnist for Algemeiner and a good friend. He said, and he's a lifelong Democrat, he said, I think it's a terrible thing that Jews always vote Democrat. Why? Because no politician should ever take our vote for granted. They should earn it again and again every time. And I think in that sense, it's a mistake for Jews in general to jump in bed completely with any political party. We've got to judge each election, look at how our interests are best served and how our concerns are best addressed. And even if we're supporting one party, we can call out the elements of that party or the aspects of that party that we're not comfortable with and that we don't like. We have to remain vigilant all the time and never allow ourselves to be taken for granted and to call out bigots and haters and tolerance for bigots and haters wherever we find it.
Okay, Rivka, I agree completely with what Dovid just said. It's very simple. I think it's very troubling for us to categorize and generalize. If we see people and behaviors that are inconsistent with our values, it behooves us to call them out and to work to correct them. But to say all Democrats, okay, you can't support any Democrats, for example, We have two Jewish Democrats in Congress who are doing a very good job supporting Israel and bringing other people along, Max Rose and Josh Gottheimer. Both of these guys are big supporters of Israel, big supporters of moderation and centrism, and we need those people in Congress. They both happen to be not aligned with the party line and with the party platform on certain issues relevant to Israel. So much the better. But if we don't support those people who are in those positions, then we risk handing victory to the people whose views are deeply opposed to ours. And I look, by reference to the broader conversation, I don't want to give anybody the impression that I'm all in for any particular force that's got characteristics and features of it that are inconsistent with our values. I'm just raising questions here and trying to encourage that we have open minds. The reason why Jews have been traditionally supporters of the Democratic Party is because of Jews' sympathy to the underdog and empathy for people who are treated unequally and aspiration to see the world a better place. Now, Tikkun Olam Jews, as some people call them, are also misinformed and doing damage to Israel through the mechanisms of their focus on the Palestinians and their thoughts about how the Palestinians issue should be resolved. But that's a question for conversation. I don't think that it's constructive for us to question everyone's motivations when many of those people are very well motivated with the same values as ours. Dovid is right. We have to call out the ones who are not.
Daniel, if we could just take one more question, and we really need to end after this last question. I think there's some questions brought up in the chat.
Yes. How do we think the moods on campuses will change if Biden is the president in the president's seat in a few weeks?
To be honest, I think the changes that are happening on campus are regardless of who the president is. The campus communities are ecosystems of their own, and developments in those ecosystems have been on the march for some time. It doesn't seem that who the president is or isn't has an impact per se. The impact that the Trump administration has had has not been on the mood. It's been on legislation. It's been on who it's appointed, in the education department to oversee civil rights issues. People like Ken Marcus, for example, and new enactments like the Title VI enactment that create new tools and new opportunities for supporters of Israel on campus really to defend themselves. But in terms of the mood and in terms of where the campus community is at, in terms of its alliance with this sort of new insidious ideology that we've been talking about in the Barry Weiss article, it appears to be a juggernaut that's on the march and is making considerable progress regardless of who's in the White House.
Rabbi, before we wrap up, a lot of people are still on the phone or on the chat. If people want to continue, and you and others need, and Dovid or whoever need to sign off for other commitments, is it okay to keep it open?
Yes, I believe so. Dovid, you're available to stay on?
I actually have to head out now, but I'm happy to continue to engage, via email if anybody.
If that's the case, maybe please.
We can wrap it up now.
We'll have opportunities in the future to have more presentations, and I think this was a very stimulating morning, exciting morning, as you said, thought-provoking, and we'll definitely have opportunities in the future to do it again. So I want to thank you, Dovid, for your time today and everything you do for our shul and the Jewish world, and you, Daniel, as well, for your activism and your heart and your strength. Please, God, everyone should have a happiness in their personal lives and in the communal life, and only good tidings to our community, Jewish world, and the world at large. We are one broader community of humanity, which the pandemic has taught us, and we all need to take care of one another ultimately, which is what Judaism believes will happen one time in the future. Until that time, we try to stand up for our values, our ideals, and please God, only good tidings to everyone. Thank you all for joining us.
I'm Israel High.
I'm Yisrael.
Thank you all.
Thank you all. Thank you all for joining us. Okay, bye-bye.
All right.